All right, so here we are. By popular demand, everybody said they wants to see me shoot a video on how to do the teardown on the midboard CVs. So with the help of my new cameraman Julio from C.V.REPAIR is shooting a video for us. So welcome. We're going to see if we can get this done. We're going to do a complete teardown. We're going to go ahead and change out the CV, or at least pretend to. I've already done the other side, so I've already got all the tools set up, and this is basically how I do it. So if it's not done the way the dealer wants it done, oh well. So the first thing I'm going to do is get the tire off. It's got loading tires on it right now, so it fits in the toy hauler. Now this side does not need to come completely apart, because the only thing I'm really doing to this side is I'm putting a new boot flange on the inside, updating them to steel, because my other side's the one that ripped out a couple weeks ago when we were doing it. But I figured this side has never broken or had a problem. There's no scratches or glitches on this side, so this is a perfect side. Those are my spacers for my paddles, and to keep my loading tires from not dragging on stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to take a 3/16 Allen. Your bolts may be different. Oh, I guess I should say what I'm working on. So the car that I have, for those of you that don't know, this is a 2001 Tatum Sand Demon. And a lot of you guys know I call this Tatum OS1. The OS stands for old school, first generation for me. But this one, the outer dust cap is an aluminum cap, and it's got a 3/16 Allen wrench, 3 of them holding it in. So once we get this off, without dropping the bolts on the ground, I just want to look on the inside of it and make sure I don't have any metal in there. No grease. Axle's not hitting the inside of the cap, which it never does on mine. But if you see dents on the inside of your cap, you got to deal with axle length. And then on mine, on the outside only, not the inner side, I run safety wire to keep the bolts from coming loose. So all of these have to be cut off. Somebody probably has a better way of doing this, but it's the way I've been doing it. That one was already broken, which makes me wonder if this side started pulling the threads out on one already, like the other side did. Now, back in 2001, I'm sure this car was state of the art. Nowadays, the cars they're running out at the sand drags are worth more than a house. And they got some pretty good equipment in them. But that's not my budget. This is. So real quick, I'm going to get in front of the cameraman, block his view. I just want to check and see if any of these bolts, yep, that one was loose, that one was loose, that one was loose, that one was loose, that one was loose. So it's pulling the aluminum threads back. All of these things were torqued when we started. So, depending on how your car is set up, you should have either a snap ring or a spiral ring at the end of the shaft. Where'd my pick go? My bad. Figure out where the end of this thing is. That's the one downfall to my eyesight, is I don't see these like I used to. Okay, that ain't it. I'm looking for where the tail end of it lifts up. There it is. Now, you're not supposed to reuse these. So I'm going to tell you guys if you take these off to replace these, but as long as they're not stretched out, I've reused mine, and I usually do it about 1 or 2 trips and then I change them out. So that'll allow me to pull that shaft out. So the next step that we're going to do is going to be from over here. And I am going to pull my brake caliper off. Leo, does this seem too dark?
Yeah, looks good.
Because I can put I got a backlight I can put behind us that'll light this up a little bit.
You can see all the bolts.
So it's pretty clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Find a happy place for your brake caliper. And it's gonna fall. Do me a favor and pause that for a second, would you? All right, so all I paused for was I don't want my brake caliper hanging on my hose. On the other side, I was able to set it up and it stayed there. It was a different angle. So all I did was just put a zip tie on my main power harness just to hold it, just so it stays there. And then I'm going to put my bolts back in the swing arm so I know where they go and where they're at. Okay, so there's different ways people do this. This is the way I do it. For those of you that don't know, this is a 930 300M shaft. This is actually a factory Tatum shaft. These have to go in the same rotational direction when you put them back on if you take them off. And you notice I've got mine marked right and left. It really doesn't matter to me, in my mind, engineers can disagree whether this shaft is on the right side or the left side. What's important is which way it rotates. If I was to take this off and flip it and go the other way with it, that's when the shafts will break when you're under load. So what I do to I've tried to mark them in all different ways, but I always find a way to wipe the mark off and never know. So I figured this out. Take a zip tie and set it up so that the zip tie is pointing forward to the car. Just like that. And so no matter how this shaft goes, as long as this zip tie points to the front of the car, I know the rotation is going to be in the right direction. So with that being said, I am going to take a 5/16 wobbly and I am going to loosen. Ooh, that's interesting. Once again, $300 a piece for high-end German race-prepped clicking CV joints. I just got that fixed from the last time and now it's clicking again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take, I don't ever use zip ties and I don't ever use hose clamps. The race team has told me that for my particular situation, should I ever break a CV, the shaft will spin in this housing without tearing the boot in half, so you don't end up driving back wherever you're going with the torn boot when you're out in the middle of nowhere, for the most part. But this is my little cheater way of getting the boots. I just put a screwdriver in there and just give it a little shot of WD-40, and then I'll wipe that down after a bit. Hey, my WD-40 broke. Oh, the end of my WD-40 can, but that's okay, it slides now. There we go. Never fails to shoot a video video. Somebody's got to show off. Got nice back and forth on this. Okay, so then we're going to take off the outer boot. This is probably boring for a lot of people because you probably know about this, but I said I'd do it step by step. Start to finish. All right. Come on. This one here, I take all the way off because when I go to put the boot back on, the clamp needs to be on this side or I fight that thing like crazy. So, that. Take my screwdriver, find the end of my boot and pry it back. And then slide this up. All right. So now I'm going to switch over. What happened to my... Pause that for a second, Julian. All right, so I couldn't figure out where I put my, is that a 3/8? I believe it is. 3/8 12 point. So I'm going to unbolt my inner non-clicking CV. And then I'm going to pull it in and bring it down, pull the axle shaft out, and then I'm going to walk my axle shaft over and set it on the bench. And we'll deal with that one in a bit. So the next thing we need to do is we need to disassemble this hub assembly. And there's multiple pieces. Right now I'm just wiping grease out of the inside. Willie and I were having a discussion about this earlier, about how much grease is too much grease or should be enough grease. You'll notice that the inside of my boots don't have any grease in them. And I'll tell you the formula that I'm running, and after 3 years with this particular car and repacking and working on these things, nearly every run, or every other run that we've been out, the new yeah, it is Swepco. I was just making sure I didn't want to say the wrong thing. The new Swepco 164 open gear, which has the anti-seize already pre-mixed in it, is the stuff I seem to like the best right now. It's it stays nice and wet. I'm not getting dry in there at all. So, it might get a little dry, but I'll find out here in a second when I take it apart. So now, we're going to switch back to the 3/8 12 point. We're going to pull out the 6 bolts that hold this whole assembly together. So just wiggle, the entire brake rotor housing will all come off in one piece. Okay, we're just going to set this aside for now. We'll come back and deal with it in a few minutes. Okay, so that's going to leave us our main housing that houses the bearings in the bearing race. And the way we're going to get it off is from the other side. You might want to walk around me on the other side. On mine, and mind you, I'm going to say this again, nuts and bolts differ from different vehicles. So you may have Allens, you may have hex heads, you may have Torx, you never know. But this one here, 1/2 inch is, they're 5/16 bolts, 1/2 inch head size. So I'm going to put all these bolts in a little container because everything's going to get washed in the parts washer or elsewhere. There's one washer on the ground. This housing, the main housing for the bearings, they're making these also in metal for Tatum, but I'm not budgeted to replace them just yet. So until these fail, or until I get a budget for it, I'm not going to change them out. I know just the boot flanges are heavier. The metal is way heavier than the aluminum ones. So the boot flange is this piece right here. And you can pop it off before you pull off this main assembly, but this is the boot flange right here. I'm going to walk this over to the table, set it down on a rag. This off when it was on the car. But you just whack it, it'll come off. Normally I clean these up for reassembly, but these aluminum ones are going bye-bye. We're going to be putting on Tatum's new upgraded steel boot flanges, which hopefully I won't be pulling the threads out of when I yank my parking brake at 40 miles an hour up in the dunes. So, yeah. Put that right there. All right, so now what we have on the assembly, and I'm not really sure what the technical lingo is for this. I just call it the bearing carrier. This is the assembly that houses the CV and the bearings and all of that. So we have two seals to deal with. The seal that's actually holding this bearing in, and then there's a seal that's on the inside of the rotor assembly that I'll show you in a little bit. So right now what I want to do is I want to disassemble by just turning the cage sideways. Just let all the balls fall out. Everything will just disassemble like that. Make sure you got 6 balls falling out of it would be ideal. If you've got less than 6 balls or more than 6 balls, you have a problem. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to disassemble this and make sure that this whole thing was orientated right. So we're going to go over here to the shop press, and what we're going to try to do is we are going to, I'll show you this up close real quick. Can you see this?
Yep.
So on the outer edge of this seal, where the seal presses into the assembly, I'm going to put the 4 corners of these, of my machine, just on the aluminum. So when I press the bearing, it's going to press the seal out with it, kind of like when you do a front brake job on a car or a truck that has it. Why my flashlight had to be so far away. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just looking underneath for where this thing's got to sit. It's pretty close to the ragged edge is basically where it's got to be. It's only going to overlap about 1/4 of an inch if it's lucky on both sides. Like that. Okay, just a hair in on this side. Okay, so we should be good right there. Okay, so the CV for the midboard is pressed into the bearings. And to be able to disassemble it, if you have to change it, let me get into the picture on this real quick. You don't have to do this if all you're doing is just a cleaning on the CVs. You can actually just clean the inside up, repack it, and put it back together. So this is more for people that have to change them, and this is basically what we're doing. So I'm using a shop press. This probably could be done with a bearing race installer tool, you know, aluminum bearing race installer tool, although I think it would be really difficult to get everything lined up. So I use a old transmission component that fits down. We're not pressing, if you look in, I don't know if you can zoom in here, Julio. We're not pressing on the bearing at all. We're just putting this on top of the actual inner seat, or the outer CV, would be the outer CV, the CV component itself. And then what I'm going to do is put a flat spot down there, and then I'm going to put a spacer to save us from having to wait a half an hour for the press to go down. And then I'm just going to press this thing down. And as long as I'm lined up on the bottom, it should press the seal and the bearing completely out. Just like that. Pull my little tool out. And then on the other side, once again, pause that for just a second. Back on. Okay, so all I'm doing right now is I'm going to mark this outer bearing with just a little bit of a mark. You want to show them that? I got to remember not to talk when I'm far away from the camera. So the reason why I did that and just put a little glitch in it is because I want to remember that that's the outside bearing when I do the reassembly, because I want it to go back in the same place it came out. So I'm going to put that in a bucket, and now we've got, what we're left with is the seal that came out, which I'm going to reuse because there's nothing wrong with it. And then we have this assembly right here. So now we have the CV that's pressed in to this bearing here, and we need to get that off. So the way I've been doing this is take the same assembly and put it back down on there and drop this in backwards right into the race, the outer race. Put your press back on it. This is the way I've been doing it. Okay? This time, if you have a big shop press, as we found out on the other side, you might want to put your hand underneath it. Because stuff will fall through. I caught the race, or the CV, and only the other piece fell. So we're good to go. So now we're going to take this. Let's go ahead and walk around over here. We're done with the press for right now. Okay, so what we have right now is we have all of our pieces, and now, assuming that we were going to be putting a new CV in, which I'm not going to be doing because this is actually fairly new, first I have to clean it and inspect it and make sure that there's nothing wrong with it. And I'm doing this off the record, so this is not being done through my company. Therefore, I'm going to use gasoline, because there is no chemical in the state of California any longer that will clean wheel bearing grease. Unless you have $1,000 to buy 24 cases of brake cleaner, and that still takes forever. So go down to your local gas station and buy yourself some high-tech racing fuel, 89 octane. I'm just kidding. You seem far away over there. So what I want to do is make a fairly clean environment for all of these pieces. This is our wheel bearing grease for when we do our reassembly. So right now, I'm going to take a brush and I'm going to clean up all my parts, and I'm going to let him watch me do like the first one, but basically the process I'm going to use on this is the same process I'm going to use on all the other pieces. So I think maybe I'll videotape how I clean one of the bearings, because that's probably one of the things people will want to know is how I got the bearings cleaned and inspected, but all the other pieces are just, gasoline totally dissolves this grease. I don't care how much Bel Ray is in it, gasoline just makes it go away. Just use a little brush. I was joking with Julio earlier and telling him that after you're done with this, you know, you can be California compliant and reuse it. Just take the gasoline that's left over and pour it back in your vehicle, and the grease will grease your fuel injectors and lubricate the system. And then I'm like, no, people will probably take that seriously. So don't do that. It's funny to think about. So because I'm in a shop, I have access to a couple of things most of you won't have, but once I get the gasoline off of it, you can wipe it down with paper towels, but I actually walk it over and rinse it off in my parts washer and then blow dry it. And for those of you that can see the background in my shop, which hopefully you can't see a lot of, excuse the mess. That's been extremely busy around here. And I'm lazy. Take whichever one you want. So get that going, and then take my air blower. And then I just need to inspect this and look and see. We had a pretty nasty click on this thing, and I don't know where the click was coming from. I don't feel any imperfections in this. Put that there. So the next piece in the clicking process that I would like to see is the star, the centerpiece. Because if this has got a crack in it or something like that, I can hear Julio thinking, God, that looks easy now. I'm only running 22.2 degrees of angle on my axle shaft, so I have no idea why I'm clicking, because I don't see anything wrong with these. I'm going to go rinse this one off. I'm thinking it was just clicking from angle, but I had these orientated 90 degrees. So I don't know why. I don't feel any divots in here. So I will wait and see when we re-grease it and put it back together if it still clicks. So let's do one of the bearings on video, and then I'm going to go ahead and let him rest his arm, and I'm just going to clean everything else up and lay it out on the table, and then we'll get together with reassembly and how I press everything and all of that. But does this say how many minutes of record time on the screen we have right now?
No.
Okay.
Says we're at 29.
29 minutes?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so we're gonna have to, I think it shuts off automatically around 30. So. So if the video cancels, we'll just restart it. Is it giving you a warning? No? Yeah. This is all there is to it. Cleaning parts. And I'm going to go rinse this one off. Dun, dun, dun. All right, so that's how I clean the bearing, and you'll inspect your bearings, make sure you don't have any marks, pits. If you have pitting, like little dots that show up, little negative divots in the bearings, change them, because that's a bearing that's coming apart. Usually you can also tell when you're pulling it down, the grease, if it's got metallic look to it, then you probably have either a bearing or one of the balls or something that's messed up. So at this stage, I'm gonna go ahead and pause this and let him rest. I'm gonna clean all this up, and then when we start the video back up, all this will be laid out, ready to go. Go ahead and end the video. All right, welcome back. I got all the parts cleaned up, and now it's time for reassembly. So for those of you that know how to orient a CV or orientate a CV joint, you can fast forward past all this, but there is a specific way to put a joint back together. And if Julio will come towards me, I will walk you through the procedure. So most, if not all, CV joints should have a groove around the outside of it. That groove should, in a perfect world, always face to the outside of the shaft. Not necessarily outside of the vehicle, but whichever way your shaft is. So if it's going to be an outer CV, then it's going to be facing the outside of the car. If it's going to be an inner CV, it's going to be facing the inside of the car. So that's one of the most important parts to focus in on. The other thing is then you have your star, which has a smooth side and a raised side in a perfect world. At least every one I've done has. The smooth side should orient towards the line. So you should have your smooth side and your line facing the same way, which is the outside of the shaft. Now, on these particular CVs that I picked up from CarTech, and I'll see if I can put a link, matter of fact, for everything that I'm using that has a parts number to it, I'll try to do a link in the description underneath the video for you guys to look at. Including a link over to SubiWorks, which is Chris and Julio over there. Those guys are good guys, so if you guys got Subaru stuff that I don't work on, take it over to him, because that's where I send all my customers. So anyway, there's the plug for Chris, and the cage, which is what houses the balls. My cage is the same on both sides. There's no difference in the thickness. But if you have a cage that has a thick flange on one side and a thin flange on the other, or face, however you want to say it, the thin wall should always go towards the shaft. So I'm assuming that's for clearance purposes for the angle of the shaft and the angle of the joint, but that's how the orientation books all say to do it. In my case, it doesn't matter. It can go either way. So I actually assemble my CV after I press it, because getting grease all over everything doesn't help clean up at all. So the first thing you have to do is think about your bearing carrier assembly and use brain cells to make sure that that line ends up at the right location. Now, like I said, well, I didn't say this, I'm going to now. The outside of the car is the narrowest portion of the carrier, okay? So that is going to be the side that that line is going to go on. So when I go to press this thing together, I want that facing, I just messed this up, didn't I? So when I go to press this, I'm going to press it this way, so I need to make sure that that line is facing down. Okay? And then we'll worry about assembling and greasing a little bit later in the video. So what I want to do right now is just get a little bit of red. I use red and tacky, which is a pretty good, it's a GL5 wheel bearing grease. One of the things I like about it is it already comes pre-mixed with just a little bit of anti-seize, so it never really turns to water, which keeps it from running and getting all over the inside of your wheels and stuff. Just give yourself a nice little light coat on the inside of both of your bearing races, and make sure to look at your races, make sure you don't have any pits, scoring, anything damaged. And you don't have to pack these things with grease. I know that might trigger a debate, which will be interesting to read. I'll ignore most of them anyway. But we're going to do that, and then I'm going to turn it upside down, and then I'm going to do something I should have done the first time before I grease this, which is I need to inspect every one of these holes and make sure that none of them have torn threads, because my assembly is made of aluminum, not steel, because I've got an older assembly from 2001. They're making these out of steel now. And when I go to torque these down, I torque them to 20 foot-pounds. If the threads are weak, they'll just pull out. So they do have, from what I understand from Rich and Patty over at Tatum, if you're running the Tatum like I am, they make these in steel now. They no longer make them in aluminum. At least I don't think they're making them anymore. So I'd like to put the steel ones in, but budget calls. So the first thing I'm going to do, because we're going to press this upside down, because when we put it in the press, and this is important, guys, when you put this bearing in here, I don't know if Julio can get this on the camera, but the actual race of the bearing, the tapered bearing, is higher than the aluminum. So when we turn this upside down and we press, that was good. We're not pressing on the actual housing at all. We're going to be pressing against the bearing to bearing press. So we're not really going to be putting any pressure on this. If you try to press it upside down, you're just going to push the back bearing right out. You're not going to be able to push it together. But first, I am going to put all the balls back in their little circle. And then, if you remember correctly, we marked one of our bearings with the grinder, just a little bit of a notch, which is right there. Okay, and that was our outer bearing. So, can you pause that for just a second? All right, so I just wanted to make sure that I had my orientation proper. So the outer, the one that I notched, is going to go on the narrow side. And so we're going to pack these bearings old school. Bearing pack 101. So I just put a bunch of grease in the palm of my hand and I just roll it back. Can you zoom in here and actually see it come through the bearing, the needles? Yeah. Can you guys see that where the grease is coming through? Once the grease starts to come through, then that bearing, the bearing's packed in that particular location. And all you're doing is just dragging and pushing it through, and you'll see there'll be little dots coming up through there. And you just keep doing this until it goes all the way around. Once you get it like that, and it comes up through all the different needles, rollers, bearings, whatever you want to call them. That's pretty much all of it. Then we're going to give it a nice little lube on the outside. In a perfect world, as I like to say, these things should be protected from sand, water, and everything else through the seals that are protecting it, and you really don't need to smother these things in wheel bearing grease. And I've had this car a little over 3 years now. I've had these hub assemblies off. That's why I'm so familiar with them. I've had them off at least a half a dozen times per side because I do a constant check on this car because of how hard I am driving it. And I have never once seen any imperfections in the bearings, any hot spots, any metal fatigue. So, like I say in some of my other videos, if it hasn't given me a problem, why would I change the way I do it? So the outer bearing is now greased and inside the housing assembly. And what we need to do now is do the inner bearing. Grab a big old handful of grease. There's actually a tool for this. Believe it or not, in 35 years of turning wrenches, I have never bought one. I've worked for shops that owned them, but I have never actually purchased one myself because there's something fun about greasing them this way. Huh, Julio?
Yeah.
Reminds me of the days when Mama said, "Don't get dirty, you got school." I said, "Yeah, Ma, don't worry, I'll be dirty for school." Give this thing a nice coat of grease all the way around. And then once we get that done, we're going to drop that thing in there just like that. I usually use blue towels. You don't have to use shop rags. This is an expensive way of doing this. But last week, I actually ran out of my blue shop towels. And I have not had a chance to go. Oh, on a side note that I thought was kind of interesting, this table that I'm working on right now has had a hell of a life in the last 48 hours. 24 hours ago, this table was at the Kurt Leduc swap meet at the casino with parts on it. We actually did pretty good, better than I expected. And now here it is 24 hours later and it's being used to shoot a video on the Tatum. So this table's had quite a few 100-mile life given to it here. So pick up your assembly, try to hold it all together. Grab your CV, the main part of your CV, and what we're going to do is we're going to bring our plates together on our shop press, and we're going to set the cage down just like that. Get a nice close-up of that so they can see in case they, for some reason, if they can't see it close. So we've got the bolt holes facing up. We've got the outer bearing already in, the inner bearing already in. So now what we're going to do is we're going to press the CV in. Now remember what we said, the line has to face out. And since out is the thin part, we're going to put the line facing down. Get yourself a little bit of grease just to give us some lubrication. And then this is probably the trickiest part of this entire job is right here. Because if you press this crooked, you got to get it back out. But if you have a fairly decent shop press that's level, mine does pretty good. It should go down in nice and easy. Wipe all the grease off of this. And like I said, what we're doing right now is we're pressing the CV into the inner bearing, and we're going to press it down through, and then it's going to start pressing through the outer bearing. And I think a lot of the people are probably going to think, how far do you know how do you know how far to press it in? Well, that's a trade secret, and for that you have to pay. It's not funny, is it? We're going to show you that here in just a second. This is fun stuff. Why anybody would want to play video games all day long instead of doing this? Who knows? This is absolute fun. Okay, so now My shop press is starting to get a little bit of tension to it, which means I'm sitting on the other bearing. And that little pop, I gave it just a little bit of pressure. That little pop tells me that it went through and it's now in the other bearing. And so, can you zoom down in here, Julio? If you look, you'll see that the bearing race, actually it's not the bearing race, it's the inner part of the bearing, the main housing of the bearing is now level with the CV. Well, if you want to get an idea of how far to press that in, this is the boot flange, the steel boot flange that we're going to put on. Right here, there's a shoulder and a little lip. That is the distance you want to press. So the key is do you use a micrometer? How do you get that thing centered so that it's perfect? Well, here's the way I do it, and I kind of cheat. I eyeball it, okay? I use this thing that they taught me as a child called common sense. And common sense tells me that if I look at this, that shelf looks like, between 1/8 and 1/4 inch. So I will press this down to what I think is 1/8 to 1/4 inch. And I will use a flashlight because it is dark in my shop right now. Okay, so I'm going to release the tension on the press. Stop it right there and don't let it go all the way up. So if I have to make an adjustment, I can. But at this point, I should be able to pick up the assembly and it's not going to fall apart, right? Because we are now pressed back into both bearings. See this little lip right here? The distance between the CV and the outer side of the bearing, that is the gap that you're shooting for. Now here's the thing, don't panic if you're a hair off. If you're a couple 100,000ths of an inch, I mean, 1/8 inch is probably too far, but if you look at this side and you look at the gap, and you look at this side and you look at the gap and you're fairly close, this is going to self-center when you go to torque it down. So don't stress over it because it will clearance itself. Just don't be off so far that you have to press it on the car. So now, I'm going to wipe my grease off of this. I, being the cheap dumpster diver that I am going to reuse my inner seal. One, because I cleaned it up and I see no damage on it. I will, for my hubs on the Tatum, post the part numbers for these in the comment section. Give me time because that stuff has to get updated. But I'm going to put this back in. Now you can hit these with a hammer. I mean, most of us grew up doing it. But these big seals, when you hit them with a hammer, they tend to dent. So since we already have the shop press, I'm going to put this down as flat as I can. Turn the assembly upside down. I don't even have to use the handle on this because the seal is not a big deal. That's why I couldn't release it all the way. Now I pump it down 2 inches. Run it down until it stops. Release it. And there's your seal. No damage. I was able to reuse the parts. Okay. So now, for those of you that probably are going to turn the video off because now the critical part's over and you guys can figure out your reassembly. Unless you don't know this part, and then you're going to stick around. We're going to put this on. We're going to torque it. We're going to pack the bearing. I'll show you how I put the bearings together and how I'm using my lube. And do all that good stuff. So why don't you pause that for just a second? All right, so now we're going to put the bearing carrier assembly back on. And I did this off camera, but I'll just show you. I took a rag and wiped all this down. Got all the dirt and everything off of it. Sand that's been stuck to it with the grease and stuff. The way I do this is I just put this thing up on here. I usually try to do the bottom hole. I try to use the bottom hole and the top hole just to get this thing situated. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some blue thread locker because I don't want this sucker to be permanent. I just want it to be stiff. Is I'm going to start putting the bolts in. One by one. A little bit of, just enough blue thread locker to cover the first 3 threads. And all I'm doing is just starting them about 1 or 2 threads, just so I know that they're in all the way. And then I'm back at that top bolt that I put in just to set it, pulling it out, putting the thread locker on it, and then putting it back in. Oops, skipped a hole. Fire me. If I could, I would stop working on streetcars and just do work on these things, man. It's so much fun to work on sand rails. Pulls a lot of stuff out of the equation too. Warranties are different because it's racing application. So warranties are minimal. Bureau of Automotive Repair has absolutely no jurisdiction in the shop if you're an off-road shop. That right there is worth its weight in gold. Tell the Bureau of Automotive Repair, go pick on somebody else, man. Stop picking on me. So now that I got all the bolts started, I'm going to do the bottom bolt and the top bolt and make sure that this thing looks like it's seated. And then I'm going to do one on each corner here real quick. Now you'll notice I used an impact to pull this out. Actually, I missed one on that one. I should have done this one, but that's okay. We're just trying to get it seated. I use an impact to pull it out, but because it's aluminum threads, I am not using an impact to put it back together. So, Julio, let me show them what I'm looking for over here real quick. And then you can go back. Right here, where the carrier assembly for the bearing meets the actual trailing arm, I'm making sure there's no gap all the way around. I want that sucker nice and flat. Okay, once I know it's nice and flat, I'm going to cinch these things down. I probably could have used a light impact on this, like a 1/4 inch drive that has no possibility of over tightening the bolts, but I don't want to give somebody the impression that it's okay to take a tiny little 5/16 bolt and hit it with an impact wrench, because that's really not a professional way to do it. And the reason I like to talk a lot, but the reason I like to use blue thread lock on this, for those of you that don't know, the difference between blue and red thread locker primarily is blue thread locker is designed to come back off fairly easily, where red thread locker is designed to have to come off with heat, where usually you have to put a torch to it. You see that on a lot of grade 8s, a lot of suspension bolts and stuff like that, where you have to heat it up before you break them loose. Good examples, the 2007 model era of truck with the one-piece brake rotor hub assembly with that big flipping nut on it. I'd love to meet the engineer that came up with that design. Got a couple of choice words for him. All right, I've got one more I missed. up here. And then as soon as I get these done, I'm going to hit them with the torque wrench. And since I am not able to go on to my Tatum owner's manual and look up torque specifications, go find that one for me, guys. 20 foot-pounds is what I torque these to. If anybody at Tatum thinks that's wrong, call me and let me know what the proper number is, and I'll update it in the video later. But okay. All right. So I did one on each side. Now I'm just going to go around in a circle. Except for that one, I'm not going to torque. Hopefully that's the only one that's got a strip to it. All right, so I'm using a little bit of whiteout on that to mark that. Now, for those of you that pay me, if this was your car, this assembly would be coming off right now, and I would be putting a helicoil in that hole. This is my car, and the next time these come off, when we bare frame this in about a month, these are probably going to get updated to the steel ones. One bolt I don't think is going to be a problem. So since I'm just going out for the old school sand car reunion, this coming weekend, this is going to have to do. Besides, I can't spend 6 hours changing the video over one stupid bolt. But like I said, if this was a customer's car, I wouldn't be doing it that way. All right, so now we've got the main hub assembly in and torqued down. This is where I do my CV install and my grease. So a lot of you know about Bel-Ray grease. This is just Bel-Ray grease and a brush. I take it and I just paintbrush where the bearings go. There's going to be 6 of these. And I don't do in between because nothing ever touches there. This is a trick I was shown from one of the race teams. And I've ran, I'll just say this up front, I have ran 50-50 Swepco 101 mixed with Bel-Ray, and my joints bang all the time. I tried running Swepco 101 by itself, and it was a little too liquid for me. So now I'm using the 164, and as you could see before, it's not running into the boot, and it's not drying out either. So that is what I'm using now. But I'm still painting these with the anti-seize just so that the grease will want to stay in that area. Let me grab my star, my cage. Okay, so as we talked before, there's 2 sides. Can you see this, or is the light blinding it?
That's good.
Okay. The smooth side is going to go to the outside of the axle, okay, where your clip's at. On mine, the cage is the same thickness both ways. So like I said earlier in the video, it doesn't matter which way this one goes. Okay, we're going to do that. I'm going to put the balls in there. And then what I'm going to do, if you want to videotape that, I don't know what angle you can get, but I'm going to show them. I'm just going to put a little bit of grease in each one of these. This 164 Swepco is almost got a little bit of spider web to it. It likes to be stringy like string cheese, which is kind of cool. And then what I'll do is I'll take and I'll put a dab on each one of the sockets where the balls are going to rest. And then here's the so when you assemble these things, okay, here's one of the other things that we're going to talk about. So when we put these together, you'll notice there's a wide spot and there's a point. Wide spot, point, and it's the same thing. For every wide spot, if you go to its backside, it's a point. So it's point, wide spot, so because it spreads out like a V. So when you start to put these together, the easiest thing you can do for yourself is to find a wide spot on the actual CV outer housing and a point, and you're going to line those things up together. And it doesn't matter which way you do it. So see, I got a wide spot and a point, and I just made it disappear with my finger because of the string cheese. And then just lay this thing over, stick the next ball in, stick the next ball in, and then lay it back. And be extremely careful you don't drop any of these balls out, otherwise you got to chase them across the floor. Thank you, Julio. He's multitasking with two hands. And then we're going to lay it over some more. That's the last one. And then the way I explain this to Julio, for me, the way you can tell that you got this CV proper is if you take two fingers on both sides, it should push back and forth like 3/4 of an inch. I have found that you can assemble these with the point facing the point, and they'll go together, but if you try to push them back and forth, they'll barely move. They'll be locked. You won't be able to do this with them at all, if you can even get the bearings back into it. So as long as you got a thick spot and a point, you're fine. This has got nice rotation to it. So what I do is I push it in. Look at all the string cheese, so cool. I'm going to take my caulking gun and I'm going to shove some grease there, 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 there. Already did that one. All right. Well, you got extra. I didn't charge you for it. All right. Then I'm going to come around the backside and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to push it all the way in. And I'm going to pack that socket, that socket, that socket, that socket, that socket, that socket. There's 6 of them. So if you do it 6 times, you're usually pretty good. And then you get to play with the string cheese because it's all over the place now. All right. If you have a release on your caulking gun so that it releases pressure, it'll quit pushing out the end. I learned that the hard way. All right, so step by step. So now the CVs are greased. Now we're going to reassemble the hub assembly, but we have one more cleaning to do, which is the outer assembly. Sometimes they have to be cleaned. So if you look in here, this one doesn't, I'm not even going to worry about cleaning this one because there's no dirt or sand or anything in here. But there is a seal right here that runs around the inside of this assembly. And you just want to make sure you don't have any dirt or sand or anything inside of there. If you do, you can rinse it out and go through all of that. This one's in good shape. It's only going to be on here for 1 or 2 runs. So I'm going to be fine. So I am going to line up my 6 bolts. And I'm going to push 2 of them through. I'm going to do the top one and the bottom one, not that one. I'm going to do the top one and the bottom one. Makes it easier to orient on the inside. Let me go grab my boot flange. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my 3/8 12 point. And I'm going to take my boot flange and I'm going to line it up with one of these bolts that come through. on the back side. I don't know if you should be on this side or that side. And all I'm doing is just getting the bolts started. I want to try to get all of them started. The reason I'm doing this by hand, even though they're steel threads, is I want to make sure that I'm not cross-threading. This is a brand new boot flange. I want to make sure that all the bolt holes are lined up right. And I want to make sure that the inside housing for the boot flange went in nice and straight. This is a little bit short. This will allow me to hold on to it better. Don't worry, I'm paid by the hour. All right, now I'm going to switch back over to my short extension because I am going to use a wobbly head 3/8 torque wrench from Snap-on USA, and I'm going to set it to 40 foot-pounds, and I'm going to take a bar and put it in here between the two studs. I'm going to torque this thing down. Top bolt and bottom bolt first, just so that everything is nice and flush together. Now, I can feel that it took a second before it seated, which means it was kind of sliding the CV around like I was talking about earlier. It was centering it. Okay, so now I got those two. Now I'm just going to cross directional torques just like you do on a tire. And then I'm just going to go around, make sure that I didn't miss anything, make sure nothing came loose or settled. One of these days I'll shoot a video on how I clean these without pulling the assemblies off the car when I'm just doing a basic clean and grease. That's kind of cool too. Now, the fact that you can rotate this is a good thing, because if it's locked up, you did something wrong or something doesn't fit right. But the one thing I want to tell you, it took me a while to get comfortable with it. This thing has drag on it right now. Enough drag in the bearing assembly that it almost seems like you're going to lose 100 horsepower. Trust me, from experience, put the tires on it, put it back together and run it. It's gonna come loose. After about 10 minutes of driving, you'll jack it up and you'll be able to rotate the tire nice and free. I don't know why it settles, but it does. Patty absolutely assured me of that one day when I called her and said, why is it so tight? And she said, don't worry about it, it'll loosen up. And I said, okay. And sure enough, so always trust the designers. Maybe, I don't know. That doesn't work for automotive, does it? Okay, so all that's back together. So now the next step in this for the beginners that are sticking with the video is you got to put the axle shaft back in it. Now, I pulled my axle out and I'm not going to pull my inner CV apart and grease it because it just got done during the last run. So all I'm going to do is add a little bit of grease to it, which I'm going to do just the same way I did this. But there is an orientation that people will teach you. The professionals will tell you that they want the stars on the inner and the outer to be clocked 90 degrees off. That's kind of interesting to do when you have a mid board and you have to put the shaft back in. On mine, I have to slide it all the way through and then lift it up over the frame and get it up. So what we end up with is it's going to come in and out of the splines a couple of times. So what I do, if you want to come around here, Julio, it's easier for me to see the big wide one than on the outer shaft than it is to see the narrow one when it's sticking up. So what I do is I just turn my hub until the widest part of the star is at 12 o'clock. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my axle shaft. I want to zoom out on this real quick so I can show. Now, if I was to put the axle in this way, the zip tie is pointing at me, which means my axle's in backwards. It means your ass backwards. Axle backwards, I'm sorry. That's what I was supposed to say, axle backwards. So, because I didn't take that off, it's not going to be a big issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to lay it right here on my cart. And I'm just going to add some grease, fresh grease. To that. And then I'm going to turn it and I'm going to put some grease on the other side in the little cavities. All right. Release the tension. Okay, so now, nope, wrong one. So now what I want to do is, remember we're talking about the 90-degree axle orientation. This is supposed to be for the cars that need all the angle they can get out of their shaft to be able to run at maximum angle and make them run freer. This car, this one, doesn't seem to make a difference. I can angle it wherever I want and it never seems to bind. But I do this anyway just because this is kind of the way I was taught. So we got the big one that's up here. So we need to have the small one pointed at 12 o'clock on this side. So what I'm going to do is find the small one, which is right there. And I'm going to face it at 12 o'clock. And then I'm going to put my axle shaft assembly back in here. Now, mine's going to fall out of time here for just a second. And what I mean by timing is the timing between the 90 degrees, because I have to push it all the way through. And then I have to bring it all the way back up here. Okay. So now what I want to do is turn. I want to get one of these bolts started on the transaxle. And I got to turn the hub just a little bit to line it up. I can't see in this dark, so there we go. My hands are just slippery from all the grease. I'm going to get my little stubby ratchet. And I'll get that one started. But I'm not going to tighten it down because I need to line up one more of these down here on the opposite side. Okay, now that I got one thread started on that, I will turn this assembly around until I get to the triangle on the other side and get that one started, and then I'll just start the rest of them. Now, on my customers' cars, and most of you guys probably thread lock these with some sort of thread lock on the inside too. I don't. I do on my customers' cars, I don't do it on this one. I've been testing a theory to see if they ever come loose without thread lock on the inside on the Mendiola. So far it's never happened on this car in the 3 years I've owned it. So, and then now that that's done, this is where some of you are going to cringe, because I torqued the outer hub assembly. I'm not torquing the inner assembly. Well, I am, but I'm just torquing it with a ratty tack. And this is how I just do my car, and my car only. For you guys, you can put your bar back in here, and you can torque these to 40, 45 foot-pounds. On mine, I do that one. I do that one. I'm basically doing a triangle, because the way these are spaced, it's a triangle. And then once the triangle's tight, I go back and I get all the rest of them. Rotate it so I can get to the one I can't get to on the bottom. Remember, I'm saying on a customer's car, I don't do it this way. This is my car. I pay for the parts. So I want to see how many years I can go and if this will ever come loose. And so far in 3 years, it's never come loose. But then again, my car comes apart so often, I don't think it ever will. Okay, so now we're going to take this boot, put it back up on here. Tighten this hose clamp down a little bit, but not all the way. And then push it in until it seats against the... I pushed it in until the... let me get a flashlight so they can see. Just in case there's people actually watching that real quick. It's over here. Basically all I did was I pushed my boot in until the boot sat up against the flange, the outer flange that CV pressed into. And then I'm going to take and wipe off all the grease I left on it. And then for the outer one, the outer boot sometimes can be a competency test. Get the grease off of it, make sure there's no grease. One of the reasons I don't over grease my CVs is because when you get grease all over these boots, one, the grease isn't doing anything, and two, it makes it really difficult for the boot to hold on when it ain't got no traction. Come on, almost. Come on. There we go. Okay. Basically, all I did was just take my finger and just, on the other side, trust me, it took a few minutes. So, now, we're going to take the... I'm going to rotate this thing back until my inner clamp is facing the way I tightened it. The smart move, if you want to do this, is to make them both face the same direction, so when you go to take the boots loose later, you don't have to keep rotating the axle assembly because they're both facing the same way. And it looks symmetrical. Okay, come on. fall off on me. Okay, right before it gets tight, push in on the boot and make sure it's flat and seated properly. And then just give it a little cinch. You don't need to over tighten these. I always go back and check it with the manual because the electric doesn't always have the torque. See? It clicked on us, but it wasn't actually tight. Inner side was. That's why I double check it. Take your dikes and cut off your cheater. Or you can leave it on there and let it go around in circles. Doesn't matter. All right. The next step is to cut the zip tie for your brake caliper, if that's how you hung it. Spread your brake pads apart, slide them over your rotor. Take your nuts or your bolts, unscrew them. Get the bolts started. Get your brake line up off your axle shaft. That wouldn't end well. Few things ever do. I'm going to do a small adjustment on my brake line. There we go. Just because I'm tired of fighting that brake line. Once I know I'm in, switch over to the electric. Torque that to 2 or 3 ratty tats. Why aren't you smiling? I think that's funny. That's actually from an old boss of mine. Way back when I was younger. Used to tell us, torque it to 5 ratty tats when we put tires on people's cars. That was back before torque sticks and all that other crap. By the way, I don't believe in torque sticks. I've proven them wrong too many times. All right, we're gonna get a clean rag. All right, so I'm gonna come around here. Oh yeah, let me grab my light because I'm sure they would like to see this a little bit better than what they're gonna see it. So. All right, so if him, me, and this assembly cannot get in each other's way, I'm going to take the spiral clip, which I am not going to use my rubber gloves for because for some reason the rubber gloves always seem to interfere with this part of it. I'm going to take the spiral clip and basically spread it apart. Are you able to? Okay. And I'm going to just kind of spiral it around backwards, pushing it up as I go. We want to get it into this groove. That light's actually causing me a problem. Yeah, it didn't. There we go. All right. Now, when Julio and I walked through this earlier on the other one, I told him there's a step that I do. Yeah, this grease sucks when you don't have gloves on. There's a step that I do that's just kind of a precautionary measure, which is I take a screwdriver and I push down on this clip. I rotate it and I push down on it and make sure that it's in that groove. This car used to throw these clips when I first bought it, and it was because I wasn't double checking this. It doesn't do it anymore. So once that's done, now One of the things we're not going to do on the video, because it's just going to take too long, is safety wire these bolts, and these bolts together before I put the cap on, like at the beginning of the video when I cut all that stuff off. So I'm not going to do all of that, and you have to have a special tool for it anyway. So if you're not using safety wire, I probably should have said this at the beginning of this assembly, because now you can go back and say, doggone it, Ron. If you're not using safety wire and you have the steel inner, I would suggest using red thread lock, because blue thread lock probably won't be strong enough for this. But the best bet is a steel boot flange, torque to 40-45 foot-pounds. You can use thread locker on that side if you want, and then safety wire on top of it. But other than the aluminum housings, those things it was because I kept pulling the threads out. The threads would just relax. So now the shaft is in, everything's back together, all the grease is wiped off of it. All I got left to do now is put the tire back on, put the safety wire on. Line my spacers back up, and everything's back together. So that is a midboard assembly. Complete teardown and reassemble, with the exception of the safety wire, start to finish. So hopefully for those of you that are going to do this, you have access to a shop press. If not, I fully feel that this can be done with a hammer and a soft bearing race installer tool, although like I said, I think it would be kind of a pain in the butt. Things would probably move around a lot, especially when you're putting it back together, so the press is the best way to go. But it's really not hard to do. I've done this so many times that if I was to just film this and not talk, I probably could do this whole thing in 30 minutes, including all the cleaning, so it's not that big of a deal. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Thanks for those of you that showed interest in wanting me to shoot the video. If you have any questions, you feel free to give me a call, and I'll probably start shooting other videos on maintenance items on the car too. I just have to figure out what everybody wants to see. So we'll see you out there in the dunes. Hopefully I'll get a chance to throw some sand at you, and we'll see you on the next video.